Welcome back. This is Brighter Morning with Bhoe, and I am Bhoe Tiwari. We're glad to have you on. Our numbers are 609-6283 if you want to call, and 609-6284. If you call us, you can express your point of view, or you can ask a question. If I can answer the question, I will answer it. If I cannot answer it, I will tell you that I can't. But we now have Dr. Kirk Meighoo on the line. He's the Public Relations Officer of the main opposition party in Trinidad and Tobago, United National Congress, and we want to welcome him to the program. Dr. Meighoo, how are you?
Dr. Tiwari, I'm fine. Good morning to you and your listeners.
Okay, thank you very much. We're very glad to have you on the program and to get your perspective. Today is an important day in the Parliament, and we'll get to that. But I want to ask you an easy question, but a hard question to answer in a way. And that is, you are now the Public Relations Officer of the United National Congress. How do you find that job? Is that a difficult job? Is it a pleasant job? Is it a job that gives you a lot of satisfaction and happiness? What kind of job is it?
For me, I think it's a great job. It's a perfect job in many ways. It gives me a chance to articulate the ideas of the party. In a way, as opposed to, let's say, being an MP or a senator, I'm always having to look at the big picture. I'm always having to look at communication with the public. I'm always having to look at ideas and the battle of ideas, and that is really just the ground I love. So it's exhilarating. It's a wonderful challenge. It's a great opportunity, and I think we've been doing some very good things. So I really love it.
Okay, just one more question on that. Do you find it very difficult as PRO sometimes, or challenging, I would say, not so much difficult, in resolving contending views within the party to finally come up with a party position on complex issues? Is that difficult, or is it challenging, or how are you able to deal with that and get a party position out?
Yeah. Well, as PRO, I am not necessarily involved in. I'm not in charge of, let's say, creating the party policy, yes. but I am part of the process, and as a member of the national executive now. And I mean, one of the things about the UNC, which is great, is the democratic, consensual nature of the decision making. And this, from the founding of the party, that was the vision, from whether it be the contention with the NAR and the breakup, or more importantly, the difference with the PNM, which is a much more top-down organization in so many ways, and a command and control organization. This process within the UNC is, now that I'm on the inside, is a very illuminating process and very important, and it really shows how the UNC is a different creature from the PNM. And although there might be differences on certain issues, when we do come together and thrash it out, there is always a respectful acceptance of whatever the final position is, because everybody's views has been taken into account, and I think that's very important.
All right. This issue of political parties I want to explore during the course of these programs, so I'll have you again to talk about that. But right now, as you know, what we are doing this week is reflecting on the issue of independence and looking at the contemporary politics and economics in the context of whether we could have achieved more or what we might have done right or wrong, but also navigating the future, because the future comes at us whether we're ready or not. So I want to start by asking you a reflective questions. How do you think we have done over the last 59 years? We are going to be 59 years old on August 31st.
I think it's clear that we have not lived up to our potential. It is absolutely clear. There is no way Trinidad and Tobago, blessed with the human resources, creative resources, intellectual resources, natural resources, should ever be in the position where we are. We should have. One of the things I like to say about independence, there are still many people, and it's like we don't want to admit it, but it's true. There are still many people who think we would have been better off had we remained a colony. I think that's the first question you have to ask. Would we have remained better off had we stayed a colony? And many, many people in Trinidad and Tobago would say we would have been better off had we stayed and not gone. I'm not saying that we should have, but what I'm saying is that this feeling that exists is something important that needs to be addressed. And in fact, I think, for example, when you look at those territories in the Caribbean that have remained colonies or dependents, like Cayman Islands, Turks and Caicos, Martinique, Guadeloupe, or whether it be Aruba and Bonaire, Curacao, etc. So Virgin Islands. So these countries in the Caribbean, many of them definitely on a per capita basis for sure. And when you just go visit these countries, quality of life, it is much better in so many ways. But it should never be. There is no logical reason why Cayman Islands is better off than Trinidad and Tobago, or the Turks and Caicos, or the Virgin Islands. There's no reason whatsoever. It doesn't matter how, for instance, a country like Singapore, if they were to ask, would we be better off had we stayed with the UK or became independent? I don't think you'd find anybody on the island of Singapore who would say that it would be better had they stayed a colony. That's the position we should be in Trinidad and Tobago. For the first 20 years of our independence, go from 1962 to 1982, we were at the same level of development as Singapore, as Hong Kong. And for the entire 20 years, sometimes we were on a per capita GDP basis, and you could put this out on a graph, sometimes we were above, sometimes we were below, but it was pretty much the same band, rising at the same rate. And then in 1982 is when the divergence happened. They continued on their growth path, and as anybody who knows statistics knows about the magic of compound interest, and in fact, the countries that made the great shift from being low income, many times lower than us in 1962, to now becoming newly industrialized countries or Asian tigers or whatnot. What they've done is they've had over a 25-year period consistent 7% economic growth, and that makes your economy double twice within that period. It takes the huge lower class and brings them into a middle class, and you turn into a lower class country into a middle class country. But it takes concerted effort. 25 years, 7% growth, and Hong Kong and Singapore did that. And if you know how a curve looks with compound interest, what happens is that it's the angle gets much steeper because the growth gets faster, etc. And that's what you see in those countries. What happened to Trinidad and Tobago is that in 1982, as we were rising, we crashed. Right, that whole 80s, which we are reliving today, and it took us, and we don't realize what happened. So 82 was actually the peak of our GDP per capita. So that tells you how much income at a per person level we made, right? So So that's a rough measure of your standard of living. So 82 we had peaked, and then for 20 years we were below the 1982 level. And it was the year 2000, 2001, did we reach back where we were in 1982. So we lost virtually 20 years right there. And then we resumed our growth path. What happened to those other countries is they shot up, and it's almost like you can't even think of comparing us anymore. But anyways, we went on a huge growth path in the 90s, 2000s, and we peaked again in 2015. So that's the highest when measured on a real basis, what they call real GDP. So that cancels out inflation. So you have a proper measure from year to year. We reached a highest peak of GDP, a highest peak of standard of living, of economic production in 2015. And since then, we have gone down. Right now, we are at the same level of income as we were in 2005, 15, 16 years ago. Well, that's using 2020 figures. We don't have the 2021 figures. It's going to be worse. It's not going to be better in 2021. So we might be going back down to 2003 level. So we are facing the same situation that we faced in the 1980s, and which took us 20 years to recover from. And I mean, for those of us that lived through that, you can remember what happened. The business closures, the houses that people lost, the property. We had the surge in crime rates. A disinvestment in education, in roads, in infrastructure, in economic infrastructure. It was a long, hard period, and this is what we are doing, what we are facing with the economic mismanagement of Keith Rowley. So I mean, so when you ask about how we're doing in these 59 years, when I look at that performance, it really, really hurts me actually to see where we are and knowing where we should be. There's no reason why we should not be the jewel of the Caribbean. There was no reason why the Cayman Islands should be envying us, why Martinique should be envying us, why Aruba should not be envying us and saying, boy, we wish we were independent too, just like Trinidad and Tobago. That's really where we should be, but we're not there yet.
Okay, in 1983, we had an oil price crash, and that set in motion a very difficult period, you are correct. And then in 2014, we had another oil price crash. So it basically tells us that our dependency on energy resources and energy income is too extreme, and I think that that is something collectively we agree on as a country. But is the issue of development and the gap, let's say, between ourselves and Singapore, or the limping along kind of process for Trinidad and Tobago, as opposed to, let's say, even a country like Malaysia, which has a smaller, a lesser per capita income than ourselves. Is that simply an economic question, or are there other things that have contributed to our loss of opportunity and our economic, what can I say, or economic challenges that we don't seem able to get out of?
Yeah, I think that's an important question. And my answer to that would be that there's no such thing as a purely economic question. That economic policy is situated in a social context, and that you can't just pick up economic policy from one country with a certain with social context, a certain political context, and bring it to another country with an entirely different social, cultural, political context, because you must implement the economic policy. You, and that takes a whole lot of things: the functioning of government, the relationship between the leaders and the led, um, the I suppose the propensity towards future orientation that leadership has as well. So these things are very crucial to economic policy. So what is the economic and social context of development and economic development? And so, for example, I think, in reflecting on our independence period, I think the most progressive period, a decade was the 1990s, when you look at it. And there's something very notable about what happened in the 1990s. We changed administration, but there was a continuity, right? So as we were emerging out of that recession, and that was what was crucial to that was the reinvestment and revitalization of Point Lisas, the Atlantic LNG, that whole, what the world came to know as the Trinidad model. Our country kickstarted the global LNG business in the 1990s. A plant hadn't been built in the Western Hemisphere for 25 years. The last one was done in Alaska. So we sort of started it, and the whole global trade in liquefied natural gas, we were pioneering it, and we had a model in where we were doing that. And then Point Lisas became a world-class industrial estate where we were the leading exporter of methanol, of ammonia, of fertilizers. We were we were the international taking off point for Lakshmi Mittal, and now the largest steel company in the world, because of his investment here in Trinidad. And when administrations changed, they didn't scrap the old projects. They didn't scrap everything because that was PNN. They didn't scrap it because, oh, that's the enemy. They took it, and they took the economy to a whole new level. So that even by 1998, when the world was facing the Asian crisis and oil went down to $9 a barrel for a little while, that wasn't the year average, but at one point, just like I believe, was it this year or last year, where oil was negative at a certain point, the price of oil. So the price of oil reached $9 at one point. We didn't feel it. We did not feel it because of, that's a whole other question of what the UNC did in office then. We were on the verge of creating what Lloyd Best, who both of us work with very closely, called an onshore economy. We actually had been developing it at that time so that we did not feel that global recession that occurred there. If you look at all the other countries in the world, they were affected very greatly. But then you see, I really believe the 1818 crisis was terrible for this country in the way that it was mismanaged, used instead of an opportunity to continue the discourse of national unity, which the UNC brought to the table. And it was a serious ideological proposal, let's put it that way. So not only was it a political thing, you would find it in carnival songs, Brother Marvin, and with his Jahaji Bai calypso and so forth. There was this whole sort of cultural. It was not just a political thing. It was a real social and cultural movement of working together. And I think the acrimony of that tie and the refusal. What I believe happened was that the country told our leaders to work together, tried to force them, and instead the PNM did a trick. That's what happened in 1818 because it was illegal that year of government. Uh, that year of government without a parliament, without a speaker, without a budget. They were spending the budget from the year before. That was illegal that year, and the PNM didn't care. And after that, it was purely adversarial. And even up to now, so all the great projects, the infrastructural projects that the PP government had left in place, from the children's hospital to the schools that were built, to all sorts, to the laptop program for children, all these things were scrapped out of nasty, divisive, spiteful, acidic politics. And that can only have terrible consequences, which we're facing right now. So they scrapped laptops, now they're trying to get laptops again. They refused to open the children's hospital, but because of COVID, they had to have a parallel health system. So it's spinning top in mud. So that's for the question about, is it just economic policy or more? It's more. So it's this attitude of national development, of the possibility of national unity. Right? This has to be part of it, because if it's going to be a war of all against all, we can't progress in that atmosphere.
You have raised two important considerations which I want you to explore. The first one is the divisive nature of the politics and the antagonism that comes with it, which is counterproductive. It undermines the development process. And the second issue is the continuity of government within a democratic framework, that the purpose of elections, I'm kind of putting words to you here, but I know you're thinking. The election process allows you to retain or change your government, but that does not mean that the development trajectory is disrupted by that process. You build on what others have done. So talk to me and talk to the audience about this issue. First of all, the divisive, combative, antagonistic, fragmented nature of political competition and political behavior, and the disruption of continuity in the development process in terms of policy responses by change governments. Talk to me about those two things.
Sure. So let's talk about the democratic process and what is democracy. Now, democracy is not a system of simply winners and losers, especially a parliamentary democracy in which we live in. In a parliamentary democracy, the opposition has a role in government. So the opposition, that's why there is a leader of opposition. That is why certain appointments have to be made in consultation with the opposition. That is why when there's certain legislation that needs to be passed, particularly when it affects the fundamental rights and freedoms of persons, as the state of emergency today is going to be touching upon, the opposition needs to be consulted, because the system of parliamentary democracy under which we are governed and which we are supposed to be governed says that, listen, the whole country needs to be included, right? So the leader of the largest faction that does not support the ruling party has to be part of the governing process. So in terms of joint select committees, in terms of parliamentary questions, the government must account to the people, not just its supporters. This is how it is supposed to be. But the PNM constantly say the opposition is irrelevant. They constantly say we don't need to consult the opposition, even when constitutionally they are required to. They don't answer questions. They make policy announcements outside of the parliamentary process. They are undermining parliamentary democracy systematically, so that the opposition has less and less power. Even when you compare parliamentary democracies around the world, our parliament is one of the weakest, where the opposition's role has been undermined the most. And Justice Peter Jamida and I wrote a book together on democracy and constitution reform in Trinidad and Tobago, where we explore this
I'm aware
issue.
of it, yes.
Yeah, and so in terms of that structurally, so I'm talking from a constitutional level. Now let's think of it as from a cultural level. Now, if you see your political opponents not as mere political opponents, but as evil people that need to be wiped out, that's different. One is a civil war, and the other is a democratic contest. Right? You have to have, for democracy to work, you have to have the ethos of a game. You have to have good sportsmanship, so that when you lose, when you win, it's not to destroy and crush the other side, right? There's a process by which we work together, etc. But when it becomes, this sort of almost primordial battle, then you are getting into civil war territory. You cannot see fellow citizens as enemies. Democratically, they're opponents, but fellow citizens are your fellow citizens, right? So even after elections, during elections, actually, and this is actually a great thing about our culture on the ground, because I have some friends from Jamaica, and you would know them as well. Political people who are involved in the politics, and they always tell this story because in Jamaica they have extremely divisive politics. Their elections are really like civil wars, with the gun battles and the garrison communities and so forth. And they were here in 1976 during with the ULF, and this story is told over and over and over again. Where two trucks were passing, a P&M truck and a ULF truck, and our Jamaican colleagues, when they saw that they were coming down, could be on the Eastern Main Road, facing each other, and then the truck slowing down next to each other, the Jamaicans just ducked on the ground, and frightened, cowering. They thought some confrontation was about to occur. The P&M people leaned across to the ULF truck, and then they asked the question, "Hey, do you have any ice?" And then the ULF, "Yeah, man." And then they gave them some ice. And the Jamaicans could not believe it. They could not believe that this was happening during an election. And myself, being part of a few election campaigns so far, I've witnessed that many times. The picong, the good-natured picong between the other sides. And thank God that still exists in our culture at the grassroots level and so forth. But particularly some of the discourse on the government side, and I will call out Fitzgerald Hines for sure. The Prime Minister himself, the type of language they use, it is absolutely destructive to the national and social fabric. It is terrible what they do on the platform, both officially and offline.
Do you think?
The economic part I haven't got to, but sure, you can.
But I just want to follow up here. Do you think that there's a kind of cult of leadership, which might not be limited to any political party, but might exist, in fact, in both political parties, in which the concept of politics as a zero-sum game is dominant? And secondly, with that, the fact that in politics you really see the the other political party or your opponents as the enemy per se, creating what you yourself are describing as this civil war mentality. I wonder if you can deal with that very quickly, because I do want to ask you a question about the state of emergency before we end the program, because we go into the news. Very quickly, please.
Sure. Yeah. In terms of the cult of leadership,
Because you said
etc.
that the people are different in the way they behave compared to the leadership issue. Yeah.
Yeah, I do think that there is a culture that and we see it. I don't think it's peculiarly Trinidadian now. I mean, I found it striking with the Obama campaign, for example, in the United States, how much of a cult of personality was part of that, and you kind of do see that emerging in many other places in the world as well. But the cult of personality is really embedded in our culture for various reasons, which we don't have time to go into. But it is not it's the zero. The cult of personality is one thing, but I think the more serious thing is the zero-sum nature of conceiving of things. And this is because of our underdeveloped economy, of our government-dominated economy, so that everything is made. And this is why I believe the government does not want to diversify the economy, because they will lose control, because they like being in charge of everything and distributing spoils.
Okay. Let us move on now to the state of emergency. Do we need an extension of the state of emergency by 90 days?
Not at all. Not at all.
All right. What is the case that you will make against the extension?
Well, first of all, the state of emergency has not stopped the spread. In fact, we became the country, a country with among the highest death rates in the world under the state of emergency. It's only under the state of emergency that we made the huge jump to over 1,000 deaths under COVID. The state of emergency is good for a period where as we advocated in February 2020, in January 2020, when the virus is just here and when you lock things down, it can actually die out. But now we're into community spread, and so the state of emergency is not doing it. It is not going to make the virus disappear. It will not. It cannot. We cannot make it disappear anymore. You know, we live with AIDS. You know, we live with polio. We live with TB. These things are around still, right? But we have come to manage it. We have come to live with it. Our bodies have gotten used to it. Our medical system, etc. And that's where we have to be with COVID, as with every other new virus and new disease that will come in future, that has come in the past, and we cannot afford to destroy people's ability to earn an income, to earn a living. That is having a huge economic effect in terms of the divide between the rich and the poor, the destruction of the middle class, greater wealth inequality, the destruction of our economic capacity. And the removal of our rights, and freedom.
You're saying that the state of emergency cannot be justified on health grounds, and it cannot be justified on the basis of the economic havoc that it creates. Is there any basis on which the state of emergency can be justified at all? And a quick answer, this is the end.
I can't see that.
All right. Thank you very, very much, Dr. Meighoo, for this opportunity to have a conversation from the UNC's point of view. I thank you very much for agreeing to come on the program. As I said, I would like to engage the issue of the political parties and how they operate, how they work, and how that operates in a constitutional uh, um, democracy, and also how that affects how they operate in Parliament, and therefore the extent to which it then informs governance. So we'd be happy to do that again if you would come. And I want to thank you for being part of Brighter Morning with Bhoe this morning. Thank you very, very much.
You're welcome. It's my pleasure.
Okay, thank you very much, listeners and viewers, for being part of this program. I hope you enjoyed that conversation with Dr. Meighoo. And we move on now to Andrew Chan and the news.